Welcome to this webinar, Nazi Germany's Ideological Soldiers and Genocidal War in the East, a conversation with historian Edward Westermann. I'm Jason Dawsey, Assistant Teaching Professor of History at Arizona State University. And right here at the outset, let me thank my colleague, Dr. Jan Mann, who's Associate Teaching Professor of History at ASU, for handling the technical background. We appreciate your interest in this subject and joining us for this discussion of a great historian's work on Nazi Germany, World War II, and the Holocaust. So, before getting into this conversation, I'd like to briefly introduce Professor Westermann. This is just going to give a small number of things about his career and work. Well, obviously during the Q&A, have a chance to hear a lot more from him about his research, about his teaching. Edward B. Westermann received his doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is a Regent Professor of History and a Piper Professor of 2023 at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. I want to note among many publications, 4 monographs, all of which figure into our discussion today. The first is Flak, German Anti-Aircraft Defenses, 1914 to 1945, with the University Press of Kansas, 2001. Hitler's Police Battalions, Enforcing Racial War in the East, also with the University Press of Kansas, 2005. Hitler's Ostkrieg, War in the East, and the Indian Wars, Comparing Genocide and Conquest, University of Oklahoma Press, 2016, and most recently, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, 2021, with Cornell University Press. Westermann has been a J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. for 2018-2019, and from January 2019 until September 2021, he served as commissioner on the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. Ed, all that said, let me just say welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to be here.
Us too. We've been talking about this for some time, and so these questions really do kind of speak to your career in these intertwined fields of Nazi Germany, World War II, and the Holocaust. Um, Mostly about publications, but also a bit about teaching. But we will be able to, I think, touch on a lot of things that you have done, Ed. And so, with that, why don't we get started and just kind of talk by way of background, Ed? And so, in your case, for some 3 decades, you have worked on some extremely difficult and demanding subject matter. Could you, with that in mind, describe for us your path to this work and how did you become interested in the histories of Nazi Germany, World War II, and the Holocaust?
Yeah, it was a non-traditional path to kind of get into academe. I actually graduated from the Air Force Academy, went through pilot training. I was a exchange pilot with the German Air Force, which from 1988 to 1991. So in that period, obviously spending time in another Air Force was a kind of formative experience for me. But what it was formative in is I wanted to go back and teach at the Air Force Academy. So they wanted to sponsor me back for graduate school for a master's degree at first. And so really coming out of that experience, I wanted to focus on some historical topic that was related to Germany and taking advantage of that language skill, and also kind of the inside baseball information you get from serving with a different service in a different country. And as it turned out, I was originally going to head to Cambridge, but we had the thing called the First Gulf War, which at the time was just the Gulf War. And then ended up going to Florida State, which actually turned out really to be beneficial. I worked with a great professor there. I was actually Alan Steinweiss, who's now at the University of Vermont. but I was his first graduate student, and he was really formative in helping me to kind of develop some of the ideas I had related to the Holocaust and also related to the German police, which was really the first area that I explored. And over time in the military, I was fortunate enough to be able to go for the PhD to North Carolina, as you talked about earlier, and upon retirement to start teaching at Texas A&M San Antonio. So I've been really quite fortunate in the way the stars have aligned with my military background to also have kind of, if you will, an associated and second career in academia.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, your time you were mentioning 88 to 91, just to state the obvious, obviously right there at the end of the Cold War and the fall of the wall. So for someone interested in German history, what an amazing time to do it and to study these topics with some extraordinary figures. And I just want to mention a few of these and get your thoughts about your work with these individuals. You already mentioned Alan Steinweiss at Florida State, and then to note three people that you have publicly thanked, all connected to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Gerhard Weinberg, often thought of as sort of the dean of historians of World War II, Konrad Jarausch, and Christopher Browning. But I also know that the late Dennis Showalter, a leading military historian, was also important to you. So could you tell us about some of your principal influences, some of these really amazing figures you worked with?
Yeah, I would have to say that coming out of Florida State and going back to the Air Force Academy, Dennis Showalter was a distinguished visiting professor at the Air Force Academy. And when I returned, and he was actually going to teach the first time Holocaust course in the history department there. And the department chair had told me that I would be auditing that course because I would be taking it over in the future. And Dennis, who I didn't know until then, said, "Well, if you're going to be in the classroom, we're going to teach it together." And he became a mentor in the classroom as to how he engaged with students. He was a dynamic and gifted teacher, but he was also a prolific writer and historian and someone who always paid it forward. So Dennis was one of those individuals that I think you can literally find, and it's probably no joke, hundreds, if not over 1,000 forwards or dedications to Dennis from historians, especially military historians, who thank him for his role in their development and getting their work published. And I'm no exception to that. I was coming out of the master's degree, having looked at the German police. You mentioned Chris Browning. He was still at Pacific Lutheran when I came out of my master's degree, but his book, Ordinary Men, actually came out just after I finished my master's degree that looked at the German police. And I was really not aware of Chris's research on the police at that time. But what it did is when I actually arrived at the Air Force Academy, that book came out. Ordinary Men made a big splash, and no one else was really writing in English about the police organization. So it led to several publications for me, and much of that I owe also to Dennis helping me get through those processes. Uh, Konrad Jarosz, who you talked about, it was just again another prolific German historian of Germany, and also a gifted teacher. Gerhard Weinberg is a national treasure in my mind. He, as you mentioned, is kind of the dean of German diplomatic history, but generations of scholars who went through North Carolina, with having him on your dissertation committee is really a big deal. And I guess I have the good fortune of being Alan Steinweiss's first graduate student, but I was also Gerhard Weinberg's last PhD student. So I kind of feel really like I was quite lucky in that case. But In addition to those names, I had Alex Rowland from Duke was on my committee, science and technology historian who's fantastic. Tammy Davis Biddle at that time was at Duke, and she was also on my committee. So, it's not surprising with that level of brain power and firepower on your committee that you're going to be able to come through with some good products and some good ideas because they really challenge you. And just in terms of that, I continue to try to emulate those people who helped me later in my career. If I can help younger scholars, if I can provide guidance or I can provide inputs on their own work, that's always been something that I felt is really important because I wouldn't be where I am today without that kind of help either from really some really fantastic scholars and some fantastic people as well.
That's just that's really wonderful to hear. And I think all of us think about the people who shaped us and who influenced us and pushed us in the right direction and encouraged us. In some cases, were tough on us when we needed to be. And what a great group of scholars. Those figures you all mentioned, you could easily just fill a bookcase with just their books. And so many of those books have really stamped these fields that you work in. And so we'll obviously be able to talk about some of this a bit, especially you mentioned already Christopher Browning, engagement with his work we're going to come back to here shortly. So speaking of books, Ed, why don't we move now and talk about your first one? I think many people who know your later work, who may know Hitler's Police Battalions or know Drunk on Genocide, they may forget that you authored a book in 2001 called Flak that dealt primarily with Germany's anti-aircraft defenses and the people who manned them during World War II. So, looking back on this book, and how did that monograph deepen our understanding of the air war in Europe? We want to make sure this book gets some recognition.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing because, as I mentioned earlier, I was in the Air Force. So, the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies sponsored me to go back for my PhD. And I was ready to write a book on the German police because I'd written a master's degree on it, and I thought I can really get that book done. However, the faculty at the Air Force School said, "Well, we really would like an air power related dissertation." And so I talked to Gerhard when I was there, Gerhard Weinberg, and he gave me a couple ideas. And one of them was, well, he said, Germany had this vast ground-based air defense system. And he said, "Why don't you start to explore that?" And that was really the start of the idea. And then as I started looking at it, it was clear that there were just literally one real monograph. It was kind of a monograph with a documents section in German by a guy named Horst Adalbert Koch. And there was nothing in English at all related to this ground-based air defense system. And what was really interesting about that is that people may or may not know, but the German Air Force actually controlled ground-based air defenses, and they included things like not only the guns that we think about, anti-aircraft artillery, but things like dummy sights, deception sights, barrage balloons, smoke generators, sound locator groups. So it's this really vast system that is developed, and it was largely ignored. So when you went to see what was in the historiography of the Luftwaffe, it was either the bombers or the fighters. And what became very clear to me, and this is where I think a critical intervention of the book took place, was that the reason that people like the kind of sexy topics of the guys flying the aircraft, but it underestimated the real impact of ground-based air defenses. So I'll give you a couple examples that I found that kind of, I think, brought some new perspectives. Number one, that many of those kills, those so-called aerial kills by fighter pilots, were of so-called stragglers, or those aircraft that had been previously hit by flak and then were damaged. They fall out of cloud formation. And if you Masters of the Air, if anybody's been watching that, you see exactly that kind of dynamic. And so that was a hidden statistic of the effectiveness of this ground-based system. That was one of them. But another huge hidden statistic was the fact that when the Army Air Forces were practicing how to bomb, for example, they're going to Arizona and they get their pickle barrel accuracy from 10,000 feet in great weather. But the problem is when you go to North Germany or to Europe, especially in like November and October, having flown there myself in those periods, I can attest to this. You're going to have really bad weather. And when people are shooting at you, you're not going to be at 10,000 feet because you'd never survive. You're going to be well above 20,000 to 28,000 feet, which has all kinds of physiological and also technological challenges associated with it. And all of a sudden now, you start to see that bombing accuracy is greatly affected. And Flak is a huge part of that as well. And so, looking at the totality of this system, I'm glad I didn't know what I didn't know at the time, because there were some of my colleagues who said, this is not a dissertation topic. This is like a third or fourth book topic, because I was having to look at political decision making, military strategy, economics, and the economic opportunity costs associated with these ground-based defenses, with this whole system. And so it was quite an involved and complex story to talk about. But it's one of those stories that I think really revealed, number one, the importance of ground-based air defenses in affecting the success of the strategic bombing campaign. Also, the costs that it incurred to Germany were part of that as well. But it was again something that in doing the work, it was one of those. I think Rich DiNardo reviewed it, and what the line that I liked in his review when it came out was, not many books get to say the first and the last word on a topic, and this is one of them. And so I felt like I'd accomplished something that was pretty significant. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to do that book, and it kind of remains, as Dennis Showalter said, it's kind of a cult classic. So I guess I'll take that, because the title just doesn't roll off your tongue if you're when you're saying it. But it's not everything you want to know about the different calibers of anti-aircraft guns, but even though that's part of the story.
I think Ed, many of us would just be envious of being able to write a cult classic in any field. And I what I recall is that I think you say somewhere that something like over 1 million Germans at some point participated in manning, being involved with these ground-based anti-aircraft defense forces, and you just showed the high number of Allied aircraft brought down by these. I mean, we can get so focused on Messerschmitts, right, and Focke-Wulf fighters and the air war, and it's a remarkable thing to look at, but you can lose track of how effective these flak units could be, and how sophisticated these systems were. Ed, so you did, I think, a real service for making sure that wasn't lost. I think about the number of combat veterans who were in the Army Air Forces. They would tell you how effective they were, and the memories they have of flying over German cities. And yes, they're of course they're worried about fighters, but their flak is just on their minds all the time. So I'm glad we were able to kind of to make sure we included that. Yeah, but I think the book that many people really have known you for is the next one we want to talk about. And this is Hitler's Police Battalions. And you note that you started working on Nazi police as early as 1991, and all of this research eventuated in this major study, Hitler's Police Battalions Enforcing Racial War in the East, appeared in 2005. And when you started on this topic in the 90s, books by, you mentioned your professor Christopher Browning, Ordinary Men on Reserve Police Battalion 101, that had come out in 92. And then there's Daniel Goldhagen's contentions about what he called a mass eliminationist anti-Semitism in his Hitler's Willing Executioners appeared in 95. And these two books would soon dominate discussion about Nazi criminality. So in transitioning this, Ed, I want to note here your article from 1998 you wrote for German Studies Review titled, um, I think it just puts everything out there for readers, Ordinary Men or Ideological Soldiers, Police Battalion 310 in Russia, 1942. Your intervention in this debate between Browning and Goldhagen. So, in retrospect, Ed, what do you think was productive for our historical understanding of the Third Reich and its crimes that came out of this debate?
Well, for me, having done about a 200-page master's thesis with Alan Steinweiss at Florida State at the time on the entire German police apparatus. So I wasn't just focused on a police battalion or even just on what happened in the East. I wanted to know what did the German police structure look like? What were their directives? How did it evolve over time? So that had been the early part of my project, and then I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright fellowship that allowed me to go to Ludwigsburg, which is where the central office, at the time, the central office for the investigation of Nazi war crimes was located. And this is where Chris Browning had looked at Police Battalion 101. In addition, since it was Hamburg based, he'd gone to Hamburg to look at it there, the judicial proceedings. But when I started to look at Police Battalion 310, it was very clear to me that the cohort of 310 this is one of those younger year groups, much younger than Police Battalion 101, a much higher percentage of either Nazi Party members, SS members, or Nazi affiliate members. And looking at their activities in the East, it was very clear also that they were a major killing unit in the occupied East. And so for me, what that did in looking at this discussion was I clearly had a counterpoint or something that was different in many respects from what Chris had identified with Police Battalion 101. And Goldhagen's work, didn't really, he kind of looked at 101 and he really also just kind of focused on a small sample set to say, okay, well, as you mentioned, they kind of were imbued with this Nazi anti-Semitism, this exterminatory anti-Semitism that led not just police, but Nazi, German society as a whole to become involved as kind of a genocidal society, which is, that's a pretty short way of kind of, looking at a society. What I found more interesting was the fact that you could look at smaller units like Chris had done with 101. The police itself is only about, German order police is about 100,000 max. We can start to generalize then about organizations at that time when we kind of get down to these smaller groups. And what became clear to me was that that the German police were clearly involved and were an important part of the Holocaust on their own right, so not just the so-called Einsatzgruppen or SS killing squads, but also these police battalions that went in groups of about 500 to the occupied East and became very involved in anti-Jewish operations, also anti-partisan operations, and became essentially purpose-built for mass murder in the East. So I think what was important about my intervention in this, to answer your question now, come full circle, was that it didn't take the shortcut that Goldhagen had taken. It actually said, okay, let's look at an empirical unit that itself is perhaps not reflective of 101, that there's pretty large discrepancies in membership and in age cohorts. And so how does that broaden our understanding of the police and their involvement then in genocide? And that's really that kind of became a signal article, and I'll share with you because this gives you an idea of how hot this topic was. I was at North Carolina. I was in a research seminar with Konrad Jarosz when I wrote this up. And I sent it to German Studies Review, which for German historians, that was like the apex journal of the time. And about 2 weeks later, I got a single envelope back. And so when you get a single envelope, the answer normally is they're saying, thank you for your submission, but we've reviewed it, but no thanks, essentially. And so I opened it. It was about 2 paragraphs, and it said, we are very interested in publishing this. We would like you to add another couple sentences on Omar Bartov's ideas, and change everywhere you have police battalion to PB. And if you could send it within 2 weeks, we would like to get this out in the following journal, which is, unbelievable. Normally you are waiting a year and a half. So the reviewers, whoever the reviewers were, obviously, and I think Richard Brightman, who had Official Secrets, was a book that he was publishing on the German police, which was a major intervention, the secret decrypts of these units. So again, here my timing was good, and it worked out. But that was really one of those. That's one of those articles that I think people could say, okay, well, I don't know if I always agree with Browning, but I know I don't necessarily agree with Goldhagen. And so this gave for the classroom, and I think for a more nuanced discussion of the police really came out of this.
I think too, one of the things about that article and the larger book, and we're going to turn to that here shortly. You tackle there these questions. I think about a webinar I did a few years ago when I was at the National World War II Museum with one of my professors, Michael Geyer, and he put out there this. I know you know his work well, and Geyer put out this out there for I think for our audience that one of the real issues that people who study Nazi Germany they have to contend with is how successful the regime was in creating this ideological vanguard, a very self-directed people. They had protection from above, but they were very self-motivated. And Ed, you have thrown so much light on many people in this vanguard and how this came about. And so we want to make sure that we talk about some of this research. So that leads me next to the monograph, Hitler's Police Battalions, a major contribution to our knowledge of the Hitler dictatorship's ultra vicious war against the Soviet Union, which you call, quote, an atavistic and malevolent campaign of destruction, end quote. So, two questions, Ed, related to what you uncovered in that book. So, first, could you take our audience through what you see as the advantages of studying what you term organizational culture and how this led, in the case of these Nazi police battalions, to the emergence of what you term, and this gets back to the 98 article, ideological soldiers?
Yeah, for me, this is where I think lived experience. I often talk with my students if they want to write about something, what's their lived experience? What do they have knowledge of from their own past or their own professional lives, and using that to kind of inform their history. And that's where I talked earlier about having been in a German unit, having been in the military. It was very clear to me that when we start to think about these groups, these men in these units, that organizational culture is kind of, if you will, the way in which people are socialized. So in grad school, there's a socialization process. In the military, there's a socialization process. But in business, or there's a socialization process. So I kind of make the joke that organizational culture, for example, at IBM may be that casual Friday means you don't have to wear a tie. Casual Friday at Google means you don't have to wear shoes, right? So, organizations have different culture. Where does it come from? Well, it's not always spoken. There's policies that dictate it, but it's the actions, it's the policies that are behind it, but it's also the leadership expectations. And this was really clear to me that the leadership expectations, Heinrich Himmler, the Reich leader of the SS, and the chief of the German police after 1936, after June of 1936. So he's in charge of all security police, the security service, and the order police. That he has a vision, what he describes as kind of a two-part vision. One part of that vision is he calls it the merging of the SS with the police. So he wants these state structures, the SS, which is kind of the political soldiers of the Third Reich. He wants the police to become part and parcel of that vision, and he also encourages policemen to join the SS. And so, what happens with that, for example, is if I'm an order policeman, what we could consider a precinct cop or a highway trooper in our normal parlance, you could wear the SS runes on your uniform. You might get better promotions. And another thing that he talks about is this idea of the militarization of the police. And the militarization of the police is an important part of that because it's militarization within a Nazi context in which war is like the creator of manhood, in which war is an inevitable and necessary process, according to Hitler. So we see the way in which the police organization itself is now starting to be kind of, if you will, tailored and groomed, and that also includes getting rid of people who don't fit that mold. So old members of Social Democrats are, pushed out of the organization. Members of the stormtroopers and the SS are actually brought in when Hitler takes power to positions of authority within the police. So you also see the way in which the police structure itself is becoming kind of permeated at the very top level on down to the lower levels with men who are kind of devoted to the regime. And I use the term ideological soldiers, and I think it's really important to understand ideology in the sense that I want to talk about it. It doesn't mean some people, I think, caricature ideology when they hear it. So they say, for example, that means they're clicking their heels together and yelling "Sieg Heil" or "Heil Hitler," when they meet each other. That I don't think that's the way ideology works. And when I talk to my students about this, I talk about if I am in a classroom and I just say, well, the left half of the classroom is going to get 5 extra points today. And I go in the next day and I just keep picking the left half and I just keep giving them 5 extra points. Well, the people on the right half are going to say eventually, they're going to say, hey, that's not fair. You can't do that. Where does their perception of fairness comes from? It's not, they don't run around all day saying we need to be fair, we need to be fair, but it's embedded in the way they've been socialized to think about a society, right? And I think that this is what I mean by ideological soldiers is this, it doesn't mean that all of these men were willing to do, let's say, what the Germans called the dirty work, that they were happy about doing it, that they wanted to do it, but they found it as necessary, and also they were rewarded for doing the dirty work. And many of them spoke in terms of, yeah, it's not a great job to have to do it, but it's a necessary job for Germany, which means that they weren't necessarily parroting Nazi slogans all the time, but they had bought into the fundamental idea of National Socialism and this kind of social Darwinistic worldview. And so I think the idea of ideological soldiers, sometimes ideology is not complex enough. We have to really think, what does that mean for us? And so for me, the book really looked at that, but also how leadership influences organizational culture and how leaders make a difference. And I think that is clear to most people if they think about, if they're in a job, if they're working at a school, does it matter what the dean says? Does it matter what a principal says? Does it matter what rules are in place? And the answer is there's always it does. So if leadership didn't matter, then there wouldn't be about 1 billion books written on it trying to tell you how to be a good leader, right? So this Nazified leadership, I think, was extremely important in shaping the way in which these men saw themselves and the way in which they were willing to act. But again, it doesn't mean it's hegemonic. It doesn't mean that every policeman bought into everything. But what I can tell you is policemen who directly did not buy into it or were willing to say that they weren't going to do it. What they didn't say was they never said, well, I'm not doing this because I think it's wrong. It's morally wrong. They said, I'm not doing this because I'm not as strong as you. I'm not as tough as you. I'm not as hard as you to the guys who could do it. And that's an indication, I think, of how this kind of standard became in place within the SS and the police that facilitated acts of mass murder and atrocity throughout the East.
One of the things that's really extraordinary is that when people look at that book, when they look at Hitler's police battalions and they see to come back to Dennis Showalter, he tells you right up front that one of the things that's extraordinary about your research, it is that you had not yet been able to find a single case of one of these policemen who faced um, really serious um, punishment for refusing to take part, or even talking about, not taking part in essentially a mass killing operation. And the way I think there's still this popular impression among a lot of Americans that there's a Gestapo official with a Luger pointed at the back of the head of everyone, and that's how this worked. And you confound that so many times, Ed, showing that no, there are many other things going on here. And if Browning focused on a kind of peer group pressure and feelings of not wanting to let their unit down, etc., there was a lot of that he talked about that you might see as non-ideological. You bring a lot of other factors in and just show us like how essential we can think about the fanatics in the SS and the Gestapo. We kind of know who they are, especially if you ever spend any time looking at the Einsatzgruppen. And we've had Browning and we've had people who look at the Wehrmacht. But I think, Ed, one of the things you did, of course, is showing these police units, these ideological soldiers, how much they contributed to the mass murder of huge numbers of people in Eastern Europe, and not only documenting that, but showing and trying to make an argument about how that was possible to begin with.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that comment because every time I speak about the Third Reich, there's a question. Well, they had to kill, right? Because if they didn't kill, they were going to be executed themselves. And as you noted, Jason, that's a myth, and it's also a myth that the perpetrators tried to create. So they were trying to show that they were under putative duress in legal terms and they had to murder. And their defense attorneys literally scour the archives for any indication. If they could have found one case, right, then they could have said, well, if it happened once, it could have happened to my client, right? And they aren't able to find that. And as you noted, then the question becomes, okay, if you didn't have to kill, well, what were the consequences? Well, maybe you got put in a crappy job. In other words, maybe you had to do extra duty. Maybe you got called names, not too nice names by your buddies in the unit. Maybe you were seen as, quote, one of the weak ones, one of the mother's boys is one of those nicer derogatory names that I'll say here. But yeah, I think that's really an important point because that myth just continues to linger. And to put that one to rest really opens up another way of thinking about, okay, if that's not the case, then how do we explain it?
Well, demythologization, it is such an important part, I think, of what good historians do. And so your work, I think, has contributed, to that. I think one of the other things your work has really thrown light upon are some Nazis who are not that familiar to, um, if you will, broad American audiences, even people very interested in World War II. And I want to just draw our attention to one of these. We only have so much time, but besides Heinrich Himmler, the individual Nazi who comes up again and again in your writings is Chief of the Uniform Police, Kurt Dahlewege. Compared to Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and Adolf Eichmann, he is still relatively unknown in the U.S. And so I just want to ask you here about what you think. And here I know I'm asking you to condense a lot of research we should know about Dahlewege. What kind of Nazi perpetrator are we really dealing with when we consider his case?
Yeah, I think we're dealing with he is, as you talked about, he's someone that deserves a biography of his own, really, in terms of this. He's in many cases prototypical of senior Nazi leadership. So here's a guy who fought in the First World War. He's wounded. He comes out of the First World War. He becomes involved in the Free Corps movement. So those are these freebooters, these units that are fighting against left-wing groups within Germany during these socialist revolutions, but also then fighting in the East. He comes from Kreuzberg in Oberschlesien, so he's kind of one of those border provinces as well. And he's a committed nationalist. Okay, he's a committed German nationalist, like many. And the important thing about that is not that all those German nationalists who are willing to also use military force and violence, political violence, in their view of kind of defending Germany as they see it, not all of them end up as National Socialists, but it's like the police, the German police, had a very nationalist orientation, so it made them more ready to embrace the Nazis. So in this case, Dahlewege is one of those guys who becomes involved with the Free Corps. He becomes involved with the stormtroopers in Berlin. So he's in Berlin, which is Munich is the heart of the party. That's where the party's born. And Hitler, he actually visits Munich in the spring of 1923. He's in Berlin with a group of his SA guys after the Hitler putsch, the attempted beer hall putsch in November of 1923. He's going to lead a group in Berlin if it's successful in Munich. So that's his job. But he becomes very much enamored with Hitler and Hitler's ideas. He is a guy that's willing to use violence and willing to break heads, if you will, in Prussia after the Nazis come to power. He's working in the state police structure under Hermann Göring, and he himself becomes a key member of the SA and within the party establishment. He's kind of like Joseph Goebbels, who is the district leader of the Berlin. He's kind of one of his primary deputies in this case as well. And he becomes a person that, protects Hitler and protects the Nazi regime. He becomes important in the Night of the Long Knives when the SS, kind of, if you will, takes on the SA and kind of neuters the SA's power, if you will, and brings that organization into line under Hitler and deal with the Wehrmacht that takes place to allow those members to go to the army. So a lot going on there. But this is a guy who becomes a major figure. I talk about leadership and organizational culture. Well, he puts his imprint on these order policemen, which would be the precinct cops that we talked about, the gendarmerie, which is like our highway patrol group, and then these small kind of communal police organizations. But he's the guy that Himmler entrusts essentially to coordinate those groups in Nazi terminology, to coordinate them and to kind of Nazify these groups. And ultimately, Ultimately, he is going to, after Heydrich is killed in outside of Prague in the Czech Republic, he's going to take over, be responsible for Lidice and some of the atrocity acts that take place there. He's not indicted at Nuremberg as a major criminal. He's instead sent back to the Czech Republic where he's hung. But as an individual in charge of a group of policemen that some estimates have are responsible for the murder of 1.5 million people. That gives you an idea of the level of perpetration that he was involved in. And as an SS Oberstgruppenführer, and that's like the highest rank in the SS, he sells beneath the radar in most cases. But I think what's really interesting about him is that when you look at his background, we see how those individuals who had that experience of the First World War, who had the experience of the Free Corps, these political fighting units that are established, these nationalist fighting units, how they become imbued with a worldview in which they're willing to use violence on a regular basis against so-called enemies outside Germany, but also enemies within Germany. And it's no coincidence in this case that he becomes a major perpetrator, even if his role is certainly underestimated in the historiography.
Your books have really dragged him into the light, and that's a good thing. Delawaga definitely should be much better known in terms of the role he plays and the kind of leadership he provides to so many of these ideological soldiers who become mass murderers in Eastern Europe. And so we appreciate this just brief overview. There's so much more to say about him, but I think for our audience, this gives at least some sense about this figure and just how much he did to make genocide a reality in large parts of Europe. So, okay, I'm here. I want to move now to your kind of last decade. You know, two books from the last 10 years you've produced, as well as saying something about your teaching and a question or so maybe about our present. But in terms of publications from the last decade, the first is Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, comparing genocide and conquest. Here's my copy of the book. It's an extraordinary and provocative book, and in that work, you begin with Hitler's fascination with the American expansion westward, systematically compare the U.S. conquest of the West in the 19th century with the Nazis' war of annihilation against the USSR. I think for many American readers, this is really startling just to see these two colonial projects set next to each other. So the question to kind of start out with here, Ed, is how did this project come about? And to take a phrase you use in a volume on German and American colonialism, what is the value of comparisons here?
Yeah, so you kind of hit on where the idea came from. It was Hitler has these statements. For example, he says, our Mississippi, meaning Mississippi River, must be the Volga, not the Niger. So what he's saying is our expansion as a nation, like the American expansion across the Trans-Mississippi, is to the east into Russia. It's not in, let's say, colonial Africa or other areas. And then he has this statement where he mentions, and I think this is a very telling statement, where Hitler says, well, the way the American West was conquered was the Americans shot down, and he uses the term shot down, millions of Native Americans, of Indians, and that's how they conquered the West. And when you think about that, right, when you look at that, that's not how the American West was conquered. And we can talk about how genocide or ethnic cleansing or whatever term massacre and atrocity are used in the West. It's not millions who are killed, and it's much, much less than that. But what's important in my mind was that if Hitler imagined that that's the way it happened in the U.S. West after reading Karl May, this German popular author of a series on American West, Old Shatterhand and Winnetou and others that are part of that. A guy who never came to the West, by the way. This is completely from his imagination. But if Hitler believed that that's the way the West was conquered, then it formed in his mind a template for how you can conquer the East. And that's exactly what we're going to see. But I think that that the comparison itself, I think, is really important too. And in terms of when you do a book that's comparative, you have to have an apples to apples comparison. And so many books have looked at the whole length of Euro-American interaction with Native America. And I use the term Native America because sometimes people hear the term Indian and they essentially think of a monolithic Indian. And we know there are over 570 recognized federal tribes that live in very different places at very different times and have very different cultural backgrounds. So it's important when we think about talking about Native America, where are we talking about it? So one of the things to make this an apples to apple comparison was the idea of the Plains Indians and the Indians of the Desert Southwest, the Native American communities of the Desert Southwest. That completes the national project of American expansion, kind of manifest destiny, if you will. It closes the empire. With their incorporation. Just like 1939 to 1945, the idea of Eastern Europe is going to, if you will, close the Nazi Empire. However, that's even problematic because Hitler had much larger plans. But looking at the actors is also important. So who are the actors? We have this issue of center versus periphery that is a big debate within German history and Nazi history historians as well. So where we talk about, did Berlin drive annihilation to the periphery out to places like Latvia, places like Belarus, places like Ukraine? Or was it the periphery that was driving these annihilation actions and just acting on their own? And in the case of the Nazi East, I think we see it's both. So we see working towards the Fuhrer, as Ian Kershaw has talked about it. These guys on the periphery want to get it done. They want to make this happen. They have orders from Berlin. What's striking, though, when we look at 1850 to 1890 on the plains and in the desert Southwest, is that it's the periphery and vigilantes and frontiersmen and militia groups, Arizona being a key case in point when we start to talk about the Apaches, the Chiricahua, and other groups in Arizona. They're talking about elimination. They're talking, and you have a center, in this case, Washington, D.C., the Boston, New York, D.C. kind of triangle there that's talking about, no, you can't do that, or the reservation policy under Grant takes place. So we have real tension between the center and the periphery in this case. And we have acts of mass atrocity, mass killing that take place, as I talk about in the book. And we see that it's also, in many cases, there are issues of racism. And if we talk about Sand Creek, that's one clear example of the kind of Colonel John Chivington, who's really looking at from a racist perspective, eliminating native communities. But what we also see, and Lawrence Keeley, War Before Civilization, and others have written about this, is that once you had native communities confined to reservations, then in the West, settlers tended to be like nostalgic for them because they had the land. That's what they wanted. So once they were able to expropriate the land, then the drive for a genocidal policy essentially was it was more rhetorical than real. So it's this complexity of these two national projects, and part of what also drove this is I think that many of my students, when we talk about Nazi Germany, they would say, well, that's exactly what happened to the Native American communities. And so I wanted to test that comparison. And there are definitely similarities, but there are definitely important differences that give us insights. And so, for example, one of the greatest American generals in U.S. history is a Native American. It's Geronimo, a guy with a maximum of 200 camp followers who keeps not only the government of the U.S. engaged for years, but the government of Mexico engaged for years. And in fact, the only time until the Second World War that U.S. and Mexican forces will agree to cooperate together is against Geronimo in the desert Southwest. And I point out that Geronimo is allowed to surrender to U.S. forces 4 times. And the point of the fact is that no partisan leader in the Nazi East gets to surrender more than once. So, looking at also issues of assimilation, that Native American communities are cultural genocide is certainly something that we can discuss. The loss of language, the loss of tradition, the loss of land and place, which is important in Native American communities. But the idea is that these tribes are going to be Christianized and civilized, and I'll put those both in quotation marks. But in the East, Jewish children and Jewish people, there is no chance for assimilation. So that's not even on the table. So some of these dynamics that I'm kind of getting to here, it's obviously a much more complicated story. But again, what I really wanted to leave the reader with in looking at this comparison is the complexity of it. And one of the most important things is Hitler's not a very good a historian, but that we should still care. In other words, if it's mass atrocity, if it's war crimes, if it's ethnic cleansing, however we want to define it, it still matters, and it should matter to us as historians in the way we teach it to our classes. But that this kind of facile comparisons, that's not what we do as historians. We try to get, I guess, to a much deeper understanding of these events.
And you certainly, and with this interest in Hitler's fascination with the American West via Karl May and whatever else he might have encountered, just point us toward um, again this issue of Nazi ideology. In this case, a certain kind of pseudo historical dimension of Nazi ideology. Like it had some notion about how the conquest of the West played out and how the lessons of that could be applied in the Soviet Union or Poland or elsewhere. And I think you point us to that Nazi ideology is as horrifying as it is, it's so complicated, and unraveling these different dimensions of it are really important because it informs so much of these programs of mass annihilation and subjugation that are so familiar to us now. And so I hope people read the book.
Yeah, if I could, I just add one quick
Please.
sentence to that because you're bringing up a really important point that the idea of Lebensraum or living space is an apocalyptic vision of conquest. Manifest destiny is itself is a messianic vision of conquest that includes force, that includes violence, but it's a major difference between the two in that respect that guides those national philosophies.
Yes, and I think there's a lot there for readers thinking about your distinction between forced assimilation, which comes with tremendous brutality. You don't minimize that, and we want to get to that in this next question, but also pointing to real distinctions between that and the kind of systematic extermination that's so central to Nazi ideas about Lebensraum. But getting to this issue about the American colonial project, I think, Ed, and especially pointing us toward Drunk on Genocide, I was very struck by what you show in Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars. I'm here thinking specifically about chapter 4 of the book, where you describe the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1864, and a figure named Chivington. So, why might this massacre, among many that occurred in the conquest of the West, and Chivington as a perpetrator, be of particular interest to historians of genocide? And does this case not connect to your later interest in the role of alcohol in mass murder?
Yeah, so the Sand Creek massacre is probably one of the most notorious massacres. Wounded Knee would be probably the other one that most people who have knowledge of the U.S. West would say, okay, those are two I've heard about. And We had John Evans, who's the governor. It's 1864, which is really important for the listeners to understand that we have a civil war still going on in the United States. So why is that important? Well, it's important because then the majority of U.S. federal forces, regular Army forces, are not located in the West. So what happens is the governor of the Colorado Territory, John Evans, wants to call essentially together a volunteer group, a volunteer militia, and to go hunt Native Americans. And John Chivington is the colonel who's put in charge of this group, and he recruits many of his men from Denver, and so the mining towns around there, notorious kind of, if you will, for their violence, rough lifestyle on the frontier, but drinking as well. And Then at Sand Creek, we have a pacified group of Native Americans that are under Chief Black Kettle, that are under the protection of a nearby fort in this case. And the Part of the issue is that the volunteers, these Colorado volunteers, the Bloody Thirdsters, as they'll be called later, are essentially mobilized for a period of only 100 days. And They, in that 100 days, have not really accomplished anything as it's getting near to the end. And so Chivington decides that they're going to conduct an attack on Black Kettle and his settlement. And As it develops, it becomes a drunken orgy that includes taking trophies of Native American women. Sexual violence is included in this, and these men parade into Denver after the act with these body trophies. They display them on parade. They put these trophies into saloons in Denver where they're displayed. And what was really clear in this case was this was a war crime, and the federal troops there, for example, some of them who observe but don't participate, are willing to call it such. And in fact, Congress is going to investigate this, is going to call for hearings, and Chivington is actually going to be called to the dock for this. Except at the end of the congressional hearings, Chivington essentially is able to resign his commission and is no longer then in the U.S. military, and evades direct kind of legal consequences for his actions. Now, there'll be political consequences for him, but he was also a guy who executed Confederates captured in New Mexico as Confederate incursion into Glorieta Pass. So this is a real bad actor. This guy is just a bad actor. But what it shows is also how federal authority, especially during the Civil War, how federal authority is really circumvented in many cases. And what is also important to understand, we kind of tend to think about the idea of the United States as a political entity, but what we'd have to really understand, it's not until really 1872 that, for example, if I was here in San Antonio and I wanted to go to Fredericksburg, which is a couple hours away by car, a lot further than that by horse. But if I wanted to do that, I would be looking, if it's 1845, if it's 1860, if it's 1865, I'd be looking at moon phase. I'd be looking at time of year. And the reason is because the U.S. military is not the dominant force on the Southern Plains. It's the Comanche. And so what we see is that we have this contestation between many groups for control of the West. And I think that that's an important part of this discussion. Now, after the Civil War, we're going to see the transcontinental railroads. We're going to see how this gets knitted together, and U.S. federal power is going to be increased by 1890, essentially, after Wounded Knee. It's the project is completed. But again, I think it's important to think about how these national projects of conquest include acts of atrocity and massacre themselves. But in many cases, Wounded Knee and Sand Creek become so notorious because they are the exceptional versus the routine. And in the book, I also talk about if anybody knows anything about Custer's Last Stand, right? Everybody understands that. And the 7th Cavalry, and it's decimated because of bad decision making on the part of Custer, but others don't recognize it was supposed to be a three-pronged attack against the Sioux. And in fact, one of the things that saved General Crook and his guys from going through this and suffering the same fate were the Native American scouts that prevent his group from being massacred. Native American scouts for Custer try to do the same thing, and he ignores them. He goes forward. Well, the reason I'm bringing that up is just after this takes place, you have in the Nebraska territory, you have a group of Cheyenne who want to go join the Sioux, and you have now the 5th Cavalry sees this long drawn out line of Cheyenne that are leaving the reservation, and you would think, well, right after Custer's Last Stand, what's going to happen? Well, they're going to be massacred. In fact, what ends up happening is they're turned back by the 5th Cavalry, and they're sent back into the reservation. So even when tensions are high, right? We do it. So the point is that massacre and atrocity doesn't always happen here. There's just different dynamics that we see, and I think that complexity of that. I know that's a really long answer to this question, but trying to really think through the complexity of these national projects gets us to a greater understanding of both, and we're able to ask questions that I wouldn't have thought about with Nazi Germany, that I thought about or others had thought about with respect to the U.S. West. It gave me a greater understanding how those questions could be used in my own area to think about the things that I thought I knew earlier, or things that I had thought about before or hadn't thought about before.
Well, I think the length of that answer, it just shows how seriously you've taken the issue of the comparative side of this, because good comparative history is often so difficult to do. And I think for anyone interested just in the larger issues about how war, colonialism, atrocity, and or genocide can be so imbricated, so tied together, I want to highly recommend Ed's book, Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars. Before moving to your next monograph, though, and I do want to give some attention to, you've talked a number of times already about students and about how important, teaching is to you. And I want to just note here a case that I can speak to firsthand about your role as an educator, educating professionals concerned with the history of the Nazi-Soviet War, the Holocaust, interested in comparative genocide, interested in human rights. In January 2020, you and Jeff Rutherford held an excellent seminar at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. on the German treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. If you're thinking about this topic, Christian Streit's 1978 book, and just giving you the English title of it, No Comrades, the Wehrmacht and Soviet Prisoners of War, 1941, 1945, is still a major point of reference for research on this subject. It came up many times during that seminar. So I wanted to ask you, Ed, about how you think Streit's book holds up today. I mean, that's a long time ago. That book is over 45 years old. How that book holds up today, in light of so much recent research, and what of it you think continues to be of value to scholars?
Yeah, I think this really raises an important point. So I've been guilty of this. I think what happens that we as historians or scholars, a lot of times we're willing to think about something that's published maybe within 10 years, maybe within 15 years, a book like Ordinary Men. Okay, maybe we're still reading it 25 years later or 30 years later. But for most of the historiography, I think we tend to think that once it's over, it's past its due date, if you will, right? That we don't look at that. So Alexander Dalin wrote this great book, for example, on the German-Soviet War. Christian Streit's work that you talked about is one of those books, and I think what it reminds me is that a lot of times I think we reinvent some of the ideas because we don't have the time necessarily or the inclination to go back 30 or 40 years to some of the literature. And that's, I think, a good caution for us to remember. And Streit's book holds up because it was one of those books that nobody wanted to write this history. And the book was so good, I think it dominated. And for some reason, the U.S. historiographical field, I don't know why it wasn't translated into English. I mean, I find that really kind of baffling because of the power of the book itself. But it really showed the participation. If we look at crimes of the Wehrmacht, if we want to say, okay, the idea of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, well, one area that was very clear early on, we didn't need exhibitions to show it, was that the German military was in charge of POW camps, and they were in charge of those Soviet prisoner of war camps. And the fact that between June of 1941 and February of 1942, 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German military captivity is an amazing thing to think about. The fact that the German military essentially loaned out to the SS Soviet POWs to work in concentration camps and other places on it to get a daily loan, right? The fact that the German military was involved in forced labor and impressment of Eastern workers that go back to Germany, right? So what we see with that book, now not all of that book is about all of those things, but if there is one crime that 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war die in German captivity of 5.7 million that were taken, it really opens our eyes to the complicity of the Wehrmacht in this process. It's not just about the Holocaust by bullets. And what I think is important to understand here is this is where we see the convergence you talked earlier about how these philosophies, these ideological beliefs, I kind of call it the rotten apple in the barrel. Because it doesn't matter if it's the German military, it doesn't matter if it's German police, it doesn't matter if it's German Forest Service. All of those apples are in that barrel, and guess what? That rotten Nazi apple, it eventually makes every apple in that barrel also rotten, right? And it has an effect on them. So I really think that Streit's work really should have, even more than it did, kind of explode the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. And Ron Smeltzer was someone who talked about that myth and did a book related to that. And I just think what kind of Kamerad did is it really showed the implicated that rot extended far beyond the SS and police apparatus. And when we look at the conditions, for example, also the gender-based conditions, the way in which, for example, Red Army women are treated as so-called Flintenweiber, literally shotgun wenches, and the way that they're executed and how those Nazi gender stereotypes also from the Wehrmacht are transferred against women in the East, I think is an important part of that. Now, luckily, we've had the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, just one of its newest volumes, is on those detention sites and those Stalags, those Durchganglagers, the temporary camps, the major camps for prisoners of war. We've got a new volume that's out from the USHMM that really gives us some great information that's now available in the English language, so that's good. And I know that the editor of that volume, Dallas Michelbacher, is actually working on a monograph now, an English language monograph, which I'm looking forward to seeing because I just think it really is inexplicable that a work that is so powerful and so important to our understanding, especially the Wehrmacht's role in the East and in genocide, is now going to have its own English language monograph is really a major thing. But I guess my final plea, maybe it's as you get older, you also think about this, is don't forget the works in the historiography that may be 30 years old or 40 years old. Is now they've been surpassed necessarily. You might find some really important ideas that we're able to kind of incorporate back into our current understanding so that we don't keep rediscovering the same will, but maybe at a different time.
No, thank you for that. It was such an explosive book. I mean, you think about that book coming out in West Germany in the late 70s, just as the Cold War, you're going to get a new escalation of that. And here is Straight deliberately challenging this myth of the clean Wehrmacht and showing just how up to its necks they were in mass annihilation of Soviet POWs. And the fact, as you noted, that it was never translated into English despite its long impact on scholars. I had to read it for exams with Michael Geyer. And I'm sure many others, students, just if you're dealing with Nazi Germany World War II, Streit's book was one of those books that you had to look at. And you noted the 3.3 million out of 5.7 million. Everyone still quotes those numbers, and they're Streit. This is Streit's research and how central it was, to us. So, kind of watching our time here. We've been talking for a while, and but I want to make sure we get to a couple of things here at the end, and among those things is certainly your 2021 book, Drunk on Genocide. So, why don't we move to that? And I want to start here with a question from my colleague, Professor Jan Mann, related to this book. It's such a The subject matter is so horrifying, and I think it just requires a lot of courage. I think to even tackle a subject like this in the detail that you did. So this is the question from Jan, which is about do you believe that the presence, consumption, and prevalence of alcohol throughout every aspect of the Holocaust, from the Holocaust by bullets to the death camps to the anti-partisan operations, was a way of incorporating genocide into everyday life, be it through rituals, to playing out hypermasculinity, or creating contests and awarding prizes for specific deadly achievements, the things that you examine here in this book. Was the incorporation of alcohol an additional way to make an extraordinary event more ordinary than for the perpetrators?
Yeah, that's very good question to think about. So the way I would answer that is the first thing I would say what this book doesn't say. The Holocaust happens with or without alcohol. So whether or not there's alcohol available to the perpetrators, the Holocaust is going to happen. Now, what was really interesting to me was as we looked, or as I kind of looked at the historiography of alcohol, those who had spoken about it. So Chris Browning's book talks about the men of Police Battalion 101 who drank largely to cope is how he describes it. So these are men who, they just can't deal with the terrible things they've been involved in, so they kind of drink themselves into oblivion to kind of forget. And as I was looking at the historiography about alcohol use by both the German army or SS and police forces, if historians had talked about it, they kind of used either a couple sentences that said it was coping and maybe a paragraph, and that was pretty much it. However, when I really started looking at this topic, it was clear to me that many of the perpetrators engaged in celebratory ritual that was associated with drinking. And so when I looked, for example, at a Polish waitress, and she remembers how she's a 17-year-old young girl. She remembers how these SS killing units would come into her restaurant multiple times a week after killing action. So she sees them come in, and what they do is they're singing, they're drinking, they're eating. She talks about how they push each other around in the chairs, kind of like a chariot race around the table kind of thing. And what they're not doing is they're not sitting at a table and just taking shots and putting their head down on the table, like, woe is me, I had to do this terrible thing. So as I was looking at how witnesses and survivors talked about alcohol use by the perpetrators, it became very clear that there were many cases in which it was a celebratory environment or a facilitation of violence. So in one case, I had a group of SS men, and this is from a witness account, a ghetto in occupied Poland, and she remembers how they came in one night into the ghetto, and she says they killed as a kind of sport. That's the term she uses, and it was like a Gaudi is the German word, so I translate that as killing spree. But the date was really important. It was December 31st. And so what she remembers is that these guys came in that night. And so what had happened? Well, they had been drinking, celebrating the coming of a new year. And what did they decide they wanted to start their new year doing? Go into the ghetto and kill Jews, right? And so someone who thinks about perpetrator motivation, our difficulty is often we can't believe the testimony of the perpetrators because they don't want to say that they believed in anti-Semitism or that they believed in what they were doing. And we can't open up their brain and look at what the synapses were firing and what they were doing. So it's their behavior, their words, and their actions that become extremely important. And the other thing that's really important in talking about this topic, I think, is looking at the words of witnesses like Jewish witnesses. So in what's known as Horbansprach, or the language of destruction, Jewish witnesses in these small communities that they lived in, the so-called shtetls that were wiped out by the Einsatzgruppen, they're looking for a language to express what the perpetrators are doing. And they come up with the idea of a wedding atmosphere. So this is coming from Jewish witnesses. And when I thought about this, it was kind of a eureka moment, because if you are in one of these very small communities, what's going to be probably the single most joyous day of the year in those communities? It's going to be a wedding, because there's going to be extra food, there's going to be drink, there's going to be music, there's going to be celebration. So then if you know that, and then if you see the witnesses watching these SS squads kill, and what they're doing is they're seeing a wedding atmosphere, that's the language they're using. It's their words that are telling us what the behavior of the perpetrators is like and how they're enjoying what they're involved in. And I think you mentioned Father Patrick Dubois, Holocaust by Bullets, is another book that we see. Those are non-Jewish Ukrainians, but they talk about barbecues at the killing sites. They talk about sexual violence against Jewish women by these members of the Einsatzgruppen. And so what we're not getting then is we're not getting these broken men who the only way they can do what they're doing is by drinking. We're starting to see behaviors in which alcohol is accompanying these kinds of behaviors, and in some cases facilitating more and more violence. And that to me was really a revelatory kind of insight. It complicates again, and we've talked today about complicating historical narratives. I think this really complicates that narrative, and it doesn't mean that some didn't cope by drinking, but what it does mean is that coping is by far and away not the only answer to how these killers were engaged. And the last thing that I would mention is it's not just about literal intoxication. It's about metaphorical intoxication. So I teach the Civil War and Reconstruction. And if we look at the antebellum South, slavery, we have the intoxication of the control over the bodies of others in chattel slavery and what that means, right? And that power over bodies in colonial spaces like the East, there's a metaphorical power. You don't need to drink to have that power, but that power is very real and it exists, and in a system in which those individuals in those spaces are seen as being literally inferior peoples, it allows for and even promotes this kind of violence, this kind of horrific violence that the book really gets into detail in describing.
Yeah, your work really just show this kind of elation in killing people and tormenting and torturing people that the Nazis do not consider fully human, and so it just opens up this very dark dimension of the psychology of genocide that does make us think more about how do we confront something like this. And I think the issue of confronting this history we want to get into in the final question. But one other thing to ask at about Drunk on Genocide, which I think your answer already is sort of pointed to, which is it just strikes me in reading the work surrounding this monograph that what you reveal to us is something very enlightening yet disturbing about what I'm terming here kind of perverse forms of community and camaraderie. That we think about these words, community, that's used, it's valorized. We like to talk about the need for more community, about a camaraderie, and about, bonds that unite people and bring them together. And what you show here is how there can be very dark forms, really inhuman or anti-human forms of these things, as I think your book reveals.
Well, I think that that's a key point of it. I describe it as this idea of masculinity. And I talk about how and you had asked this in the earlier question, which I really didn't get to, how militarized masculinity and performative masculinity have very specific connotations under National Socialism. These really strict gender roles, the way in which men are supposed to be hard and tough, in which war is a rite of passage to manhood, as Hitler describes it, in which a social Darwinistic framework is about winning because you're in a contest. You have to win, or you're ultimately going to lose, and your society is going to lose. But this camaraderie that's built up, we tend to think, and this comes from my own, I think some of my own lived experiences. I talked earlier in a squadron, in a flying squadron. We had drinking. We were at a time combat arms, which was only male. It was a male domain, if you will, before it was opened up. And some of the behaviors I described can be very positive behaviors in terms of building trust and camaraderie amongst the group, but they can also have very negative manifestations. They can be misogynistic. They can also, when we see the opposite side of that coin, as you talked about, they can be perverted in ways in which then the group and being part of the group becomes more important than values or standards that you're supposed to uphold. And, unfortunately, obviously, I always think about one of the things I talk to my students about is that we know in In World War II, we know in Afghanistan, we know in Iraq that there were different groups at different times. In Vietnam, the same way, the Tiger Force or the Kill Team in Afghanistan, that we had groups, and again, admittedly small groups of individuals involved in war crimes against populations. Now, what I tell my students is what's important to remember about that is despite all the safeguards that the US military has in place to prevent that, it still happens. So then I say, let's reason back to 1943 or 1942 in the Wehrmacht. Not only do they not have any of those safeguards, they have from the upper level of their political and military leadership, they have criminal orders being issued by their commanders. So what it brings to mind is even we can look at failures in contemporary U.S. structures, but to think about what it would be if the commander in chief or if the leading military generals were, parroting the kind of orders that we see under National Socialism. I think it really gives us an insight into when you take all the guardrails off, that's really what makes Nazi Germany so horrific in that case. And that also really reveals, like I said, kind of the rotten apple effect, that kind of penetration, whether it's von Reichenau's order or von Manstein and all the others who are involved, how that permeates down throughout the rank and file.
And it just shows just how central the Nazi-Soviet war. I mean, it obviously is to your own work, but I think for anyone interested in the 1930s and 1940s and World War II, et cetera, that there's no sidestepping this conflict in Eastern Europe. It is the level of horror and brutality is really immeasurable, and yet we're always pressed to try to understand it anew, certainly in light of current historical circumstances, not least. But that you've done a lot to help us make sense of something that often seems so incomprehensible to people. This level of violence and how ideology is not just a body of ideas. It's important to understand that, but the realization of ideology, how it's socialized, how people are brought into frameworks, organizational frameworks, where these ideas are put into practice, and where people who are doing these barbarous acts, they have protection, from above. It's encouraged to do that in the name of destroying Judeo-Bolshevism. So, and you've done a lot with that, and so I thought we've already asked so much of you in terms of the time here. I would just close with a kind of a two-part question, which I think points to the present. You've already kind of alluded to some things, happening in the present, and also about thinking about your role as an educator. And this gets to um, things happening in our world today, which is, as someone who's worked on this material for so long, how do you explain the resurgence of neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, right-wing populist ideologies 2 decades into the 21st century? Is fascism a permanent threat, you think, to contemporary societies despite its catastrophic defeat in 1945? You think after what happened, maybe people would not be attracted to these things, but we seem to be seeing the opposite. And I guess one final, very practical question is, how do you think this resurgence might be effectively combated? Light
So
one, ending with a light one.
the easy question for the end, right? I think a lot about this resurgence of fascism, and to historicize it a little bit is if we look at the 1930s and we look at Europe. It's not necessarily Nazi Germany that many people would have thought, if we're talking 1930, that you'd see fascism. Some people might have said Hungary, some people might have said Romania, some people might have said France, right? So you have these right-wing neo-fascist populists. Of course, Italy predates, and Mussolini predates his march on Rome in 22, much predates Hitler's rise to power. But I think what's important to remember is this was a European-wide phenomenon. So I think a lot of times it's because Nazism won the day, if you will, and did all the terrible things that that regime did, that it overshadows the existence of these other groups also at the time and even during the war. That kind of, if you will, cooperate with the National Socialists in Romania or in Hungary or other places. So I do think that populism and fascism do have a certain appeal. They have kind of that the idea of somehow that you can create a society in which you elevate one group at the expense of another group or others, or you find your scapegoats, whether it's Jews, whether it's immigrants, whoever it happens to be, and the idea is that those are the people that are to blame for why we're not, why we're not in better shape than we are. I think that I think that that's going to be that's going to be something that is historical. I think that that just depends. Times of change, I think, also influence that. So economics, so economic situations can be intensely important, I think, in how it exacerbates change. This growth of political violence or paramilitary violence that we see, whether it's Proud Boys or other groups, I think that's extremely concerning when political violence becomes normalized in the political process. That, I think, is an extremely dangerous time, and that's an extremely dangerous warning sign for us to take advantage of. And we have seen also, whether it's synagogue shootings, whether it was the shooting in El Paso, this idea of great replacement theory aimed at Hispanics in the community in El Paso, which hit very close to home, obviously, amongst my students at Texas A&M San Antonio and in Texas. So we see this othering, we see this kind of blaming of other groups. Well, how do we fix that situation? I really wish I really wish I knew. I really wish. I think that uh, what it calls for is it calls for a deeper understanding of cause and effect. It calls for education amongst individuals to really want to get the information, and this kind of diversity of echo chambers and where people go to get their news and to get their truth is troubling. As to how do we have we can't have a conversation. We can have different opinions or different philosophies of life, but if we have different facts, we that becomes very difficult to have a conversation. And so this kind of fracturing of political discourse, I think, is really a warning. If it continues to fractionalize and people lose faith, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in higher education. And higher education, by the latest polls, I think I looked at one from the Chronicle, which is one of our academic publications, that 64% of those surveyed had some little or no faith in higher education. Really a problem that we have to address. So I don't. I really wish I knew how to answer that in a better way. I'm concerned about it, but I don't think I can give any positive answer except to continue the discourse and continue to have discussion. I think that's really the only thing we can try to do, and to be, to be willing to put our markers down and say what we think, right? That's the other thing.
Yeah, what I take from your remarks is just the importance of good history and how necessary it is, and history produced with the general public in mind to inform them as best one can about this history, and not so much the kind of stereotype of history repeating itself. It never repeats itself in some one-to-one kind of way, but a certain kind of repetition when you have moments of, as you pointed out, economic crisis or issues about migration, or there's political instability, and how these kind of right-wing ideologies can take advantage of that and really seize on people's fears and exploit those. And so I think your work, it really does help us, at least in that sense, combat these things. I think, yes, it does come down to what kind of framework in which these things find a place. That's the hard question that we certainly can't answer here. But what we can do is thank you for your time. And we really, speaking on behalf of Jan Man, just to thank you for taking the time to speak with us about this fantastic career, all this important work that you have produced. I hope our audience out there, if they don't know your work already, will go out and find these books and articles. You'll get so much out of them as we have, and we hope the same audience joins us again. We intend to continue this series to talk with historians and other scholars about important work related to the field of World War II. So thanks again, Ed, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you to Jan as well. It was a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Certainly our pleasure. Thank you.